Bay of Biscay, May 14, 1943, 1100 hours, and Kapitänleutnant Horst von Schroeter, commanding U-640, had just received the alarm from his lookouts. An American Catalina flying boat approaching from the west at roughly 3,000 meters, its twin engines droning steadily through the morning air, and von Schroeter didn't hesitate, ordering his crew to clear the bridge immediately while shouting, "Alarm!" Down the conning tower hatch, the klaxon wailing through the Type VIIC submarine S-40. For men rushed to their diving stations, the diesel engines cutting off as the electric motors engaged, the ballast tank vents opening with a roar of escaping air, and von Schroeter took one last look at the approaching aircraft before sliding down the ladder, slamming the hatch above him and spinning the wheel tight, confident in the knowledge that once his boat reached 50 meters depth, perhaps 70 at most, they would be completely safe from any weapon the Americans could drop, because every U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine knew this fundamental truth, that diving was salvation, that the ocean itself was their shield, that no aircraft-dropped weapon could pursue them into the depths, and as U-640 angled down through 20 meters, then 30, the crew relaxing slightly as they passed the danger zone where conventional depth charges might still reach them, von Schroeter ordered his sound operator to listen carefully for the aircraft's engines fading away, expecting to hear the frustrated drone disappearing into the distance, but instead his hydrophone operator, Obergefreiter Kurt Hoffmann, reported something peculiar, a splash followed by a high-pitched whining sound, not like any depth charge they'd ever encountered, and the sound was not fading or sinking past them but actually seemed to be following them, growing louder, the pitch changing as if something was actively maneuvering in the water, hunting them. The crew of U-640 had less than 60 seconds to comprehend that everything they believed about submarine warfare had just changed forever, that the Americans had deployed something code-named Fido, though officially designated the Mark 24 mine to conceal its true nature, an acoustic homing torpedo that could hear their propeller noise at 24 kilohertz, could chase them through their desperate evasive maneuvers, could follow them down to 150 feet and beyond, and Hoffmann's voice rose in pitch as he reported the sound growing closer, definitely mechanical, definitely approaching, and von Schroeter ordered hard rudder, full speed on the electric motors, trying to outmaneuver whatever was pursuing them, but the Mark 24 Fido torpedo, all 680 pounds of it, powered by a simple electric motor that drove it at 12 knots through the water, using 4 hydrophones positioned around its midsection to track the submarine's acoustic signature, turned with them, followed them, pursued them relentlessly, and the last thing Hoffmann reported was that the sound was directly astern and closing fast, and then 92 pounds of HBX explosive detonated against U-640's pressure hull, the blast crushing the stern compartments instantly, the lights failing as seawater rushed through the ruptured hull, and the submarine that had seemed so safe at 50 meters depth began its final plunge toward the ocean floor 3,000 meters below, taking all 44 men with her, and above them, the crew of the American Catalina from VP-84 Squadron circled once to observe the oil slick and debris fields spreading across the surface, marking the grave of the first confirmed U-boat destroyed by an acoustic homing torpedo, though neither the German submarine force nor Admiral Karl Dönitz himself yet understood that this single sinking represented the beginning of the end for their underwater warfare campaign. Word of U-640's loss reached U-boat headquarters at Carnival near Lorient 2 days later, initially classified as missing, presumed lost to unknown causes, because no survivor had lived to report what happened, and the operations staff under Conter-Admiral Eberhard got simply marked another boat overdue, adding it to the growing list of submarines that had failed to report in that terrible spring of 1943. But what made the staff officers increasingly nervous was the pattern emerging from the Bay of Biscay, where U-boats had always been vulnerable during their surface transits to and from the French bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, and Bordeaux, except now boats were being lost in perfect diving conditions, in broad daylight with calm seas, where their commanders had plenty of warning to submerge, and the few garbled radio messages that did get through reported aircraft attacks followed by underwater explosions, not the random patterns of conventional depth charges but something else, something that seemed to track them beneath the waves, and at the Italian Batisum base in Bordeaux, Capitano di Vascello Enzo Grossi, commanding the Italian submarine Barbarigo, discussed these troubling reports with his German colleagues, noting that his own boats had reported similar mysterious attacks, though the Regia Marina submarines operating from Bordeaux had initially dismissed them as lucky depth charge attacks or perhaps mines, but Grossi knew something had changed when he received orders from Supermarina to avoid all aircraft contact at any cost, to crash dive at maximum distance from any approaching aircraft, to go deep immediately and stay deep, because whatever the Allies had developed, it was killing submarines that should have been safe underwater. The German submarine force had already endured what historians would later call Black March, losing 15 U-boats in a single month, but that had been in convoy battles where the enemy's advantage in radar, escort carriers, and convoy defense tactics could be understood if not countered. Yet these new losses in the Bay of Biscay represented something far more sinister, an attack on their most fundamental tactical assumption. And when Kapitänleutnant Werner Heinke, commanding U-515, reported on May 19, 1943, that he had been attacked by aircraft while submerged at 40 meters, that he had heard what sounded like a torpedo actively searching for him, the senior staff at U-boat command finally began to grasp that they were facing a weapon they had not anticipated, could not detect with their METOX radar warning receivers, and most terrifyingly, could not escape by diving, the very maneuver that had saved countless U-boats since the beginning of the war. And Heinke, one of the most experienced commanders in the fleet with over 150,000 tons of Allied shipping to his credit, reported that only violent evasive maneuvers and releasing a cloud of oil to simulate destruction had saved his boat, though he admitted he wasn't certain the attacking weapon had actually been fooled or had simply malfunctioned, and his radio message, coded in the naval enigma cipher that the Germans still believed was unbreakable, ended with a chilling assessment that if the enemy had developed an acoustic torpedo capable of being dropped from aircraft, then the entire U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was in mortal danger. By May 20, 1943, the U-boat command war diary recorded an unprecedented series of losses in the Bay of Biscay, with boats being attacked and destroyed in conditions that should have guaranteed their survival, and the commanding officer of the 3rd U-boat flotilla based at La Rochelle, Korvettenkapitän Ernst Kals, reported that crews were becoming increasingly reluctant to transit the bay on the surface even at night, preferring to make the entire passage submerged despite the severe reduction in speed and range this entailed, because the alternative seemed to be certain death from above. And when U-456, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Max Martin Teichert, was damaged by what he described as an underwater pursuing weapon on May 13, barely limping back to port with his stern compartments flooded and his rudder jammed. His report caused near panic among the flotilla staff, because Teichert was adamant that whatever had attacked him had definitely been homing on his propeller noise, had followed him through 2 complete circles, and had only been defeated when he ordered all stop on his motors and settled to the bottom in shallow water, playing dead for 3 hours until he dared to move again. And even then, he reported, his hydrophone operator could hear aircraft circling above, dropping more of these pursuing weapons, waiting for any sound of movement from below. The French resistance, operating in the ports of Brittany, reported unusual activity at the German submarine bases, with crews refusing to sail, demanding explanations from their commanders about these new Allied weapons, and several U-boat officers were overheard in waterfront bars speaking fearfully about Wasserbomben die uns jagen, water bombs that hunt us, though they had no idea that what was hunting them was actually a sophisticated acoustic homing torpedo developed by the Americans at Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and Bell Telephone Labs in a crash program that had gone from concept to production in just 9 months, a weapon so secret it was deliberately misnamed a mine in all official documentation, and which used a simple but deadly effective system of 4 hydrophones to track the 24 kHz sound signature of submarine propellers, pursuing them relentlessly at 12 knots for up to 10 minutes, covering 4,000 yards in its hunt, and the Mark 24 Fido torpedo, as it was known to the Allied aircrews who dropped it, had been specifically designed to defeat the standard U-boat diving escape maneuver, set to search at 150 feet depth where submarines felt safest, and programmed to circle in a search pattern until it acquired a target, then home in remorselessly for the kill. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot and Supreme Commander of the U-boat force, received a comprehensive report on May 22, 1943, compiled from the fragments of information that had reached headquarters, and the picture it painted was catastrophic, with losses in the Bay of Biscay reaching unsustainable levels, boats being destroyed in perfect diving conditions, experienced commanders reporting weapons that pursued them underwater, and most disturbing of all, the complete failure of their METOX radar detectors to provide any warning of attacking aircraft, suggesting the Allies had developed new radar frequencies that German equipment couldn't detect, combined with this new underwater hunting weapon that made diving useless as a defense, and Dönitz, who had spent 3 years building the U-boat force into the most feared naval weapon in the Atlantic, who had come within months of starving Britain into submission, now faced the reality that his submarines were being hunted by a weapon they couldn't detect, couldn't evade, and couldn't survive. And in his private diary that night, he wrote, "The enemy has achieved surprise with a new weapon that negates our primary defensive tactic. If we cannot dive to escape, we cannot survive." The Japanese submarine I-52, under the command of Commander Kameo Uno, would not encounter the Fido torpedo until over a year later, but when she did on June 24, 1944, the result would provide the most detailed record of an acoustic torpedo attack, because the American aircraft from USS Bogue that attacked her were equipped with sonobuoys that recorded the entire encounter, and these recordings, preserved in the U.S. National Archives, captured the sound of I-52's propellers churning desperately as she dove, the splash of the first Mark 24 Fido entering the water, the high-pitched whine of its electric motor as it began its search pattern, then the change in pitch as it acquired the submarine and began pursuit, and Commander Uno, carrying 2 tons of gold and strategic materials from Japan to occupied France, had no idea what was hunting him as he ordered his diving officer to take them deep, believing that 200 feet of water would protect them from any aerial attack. But the Fido torpedo followed them down, its hydrophones locked onto the distinctive signature of I-52's twin screws, and the recording captured the explosion as the torpedo found its mark, followed by the terrible sound of metal tearing, compartments collapsing, and the death groans of a submarine breaking up under pressure, and within minutes, all 95 crew members, 14 passengers, and 3 German liaison personnel were dead, their gold-laden submarine plummeting toward the ocean floor 17,000 feet below, and Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor, piloting the Avenger that had dropped the fatal Fido, would later report that the attack had been almost too easy, that once the torpedo entered the water, the submarine's fate was sealed. Back in the Bay of Biscay, the slaughter continued through the rest of May 1943, with U-boats being picked off one by one as they tried to reach the relative safety of the Atlantic, and the psychological effect on the U-boat crews was devastating, because these were men who had accepted the dangers of depth charges, of ramming attacks, of naval gunfire, but had always known that the ocean depths were their sanctuary, that once they dove below periscope depth they were safe from aircraft. Yet now that fundamental assumption was shattered, and crews began to speak fearfully of the Hollenhund, the hellhound that pursued them into the depths, though they still didn't understand exactly what it was, only that it could hear them, track them, and kill them in what had always been their safe haven. And at the Batasum base, Italian submarine commander Capitano di Corvetta Carlo Fischia di Cassato, preparing to take his submarine Tizzoli on what would be her final patrol, wrote to his wife that the mood among the submarine crews had changed completely, that men who had faced death countless times now showed real fear, because dying in combat was one thing, but being hunted like animals in the depths by an enemy they couldn't see or fight was something else entirely, and Di Cassato's Tizzoli would disappear without trace in the Bay of Biscay, probably another victim of the acoustic torpedoes that were systematically destroying the Axis submarine fleet. The technical details of the Mark 24 Fido torpedo were completely unknown to the Germans at this time, but had they understood its specifications, their despair would have been even greater, because this weapon represented a perfect counter to submarine operations, weighing just 680 pounds so that even small aircraft could carry it, using a simple electric motor powered by lead-acid batteries that gave it enough endurance to hunt for 10 minutes, equipped with hydrophones that could detect submarine propeller noise at ranges up to 1,500 yards, and most cleverly, designed with a sealing switch that prevented it from attacking surface vessels, keeping it focused on submerged targets between 40 and 150 feet depth, exactly where U-boats typically operated when under attack, and the torpedo's guidance system, using vacuum tubes and analog processing that would seem primitive by later standards, was nevertheless sophisticated enough to discriminate between different sound sources, to maintain track on a maneuvering target, and to ignore decoys or countermeasures that the Germans hadn't even developed yet, because they didn't know such a weapon existed. And the bitter irony was that Germany had actually pioneered acoustic torpedo technology with their T4 Falk and T5 Zonkenig torpedoes, but these were designed for submarines to use against surface ships, and it never occurred to the German naval staff that the Allies might reverse the concept, creating an acoustic torpedo specifically designed to hunt submarines. On May 23, 1943, Dönitz convened an emergency meeting at his headquarters, with all available U-boat flotilla commanders either present or connected by secure telephone, and the agenda was simple but devastating. How to respond to this new Allied weapon that was destroying their boats at an unprecedented rate, and Korvettenkapitän Victor Schütze, commander of the 2nd U-boat flotilla, reported that he had lost 6 boats in the past week, all in the Bay of Biscay, all under circumstances suggesting attack by this new homing weapon, and he recommended that all boats transit the bay in groups on the surface, fighting their way through with anti-aircraft guns rather than diving. But Corvette Captain Werner Winter from the 1st Flotilla countered that this would make them even more vulnerable to conventional bombing, and the debate grew heated as these experienced officers, men who had spent years perfecting submarine warfare tactics, realized that they had no good options, that diving meant death from acoustic torpedoes, while staying on the surface meant death from bombs and depth charges, and Dönitz listened to the arguments with growing despair, knowing that he was facing the potential destruction of his entire U-boat force, the weapon he had spent decades developing and that had come so close to winning the Battle of the Atlantic for Germany. The Italian perspective on these developments came from Ammiraglio Angelo Parona, overall commander of Batisum, who had watched with growing alarm as his submarines suffered similar mysterious losses, and in a coded message to Supermarine in Rome, he reported that the German U-boats were being hunted like rabbits in the Bay of Biscay, that whatever weapon the Allies had developed, it made traditional submarine defensive tactics obsolete, and he recommended that all Italian submarines be withdrawn from Atlantic operations immediately, before they suffered the same fate as their German allies. But Mussolini, still clinging to the fiction that the Axis was winning the war, refused to authorize a withdrawal, insisting that Italian submarines continue their patrols to show solidarity with Germany. And so boats like the Giuliani and the Torelli continued to sail into what their crews increasingly called Il Mare della Morte, the Sea of Death, where acoustic torpedoes waited to hunt them down, and Commander Primo Longobardo of the submarine Capitani, one of the few Italian boats to survive this period, would later write that the most terrifying aspect was the helplessness, the knowledge that their primary defense had become useless, that diving was no longer escape but merely choosing a different form of death. The Mark 24 Fido torpedo attack procedure, had the Axis submarine forces understood it, would have terrified them even more because it was devastatingly simple and effective, with the attacking aircraft using radar to locate a submarine on the surface, then dropping the torpedo by parachute as the submarine dove, the weapon entering the water and immediately beginning its circular search pattern at predetermined depth, usually 150 feet, its 4 hydrophones listening for any mechanical sound, and once it detected a submarine's propellers, it would calculate the bearing to the sound source and turn toward it, the signal strength increasing as it closed on its target, the torpedo making constant small course corrections to maintain pursuit, and if the submarine tried to evade by turning, the Fido would simply follow. If they tried to go deeper, it would pursue them down. If they stopped their engines, it would continue circling in search mode until they had to move again, and with a 10-minute endurance at 12 knots, it could cover enough water space that escape was nearly impossible, especially for a submerged U-boat that could only make 7 to 8 knots underwater, meaning the torpedo was faster than its prey, and the only defense was to go completely silent and hope the weapons batteries died before the submarine's air ran out, a desperate gamble that few boats succeeded in winning. By May 24, 1943, the situation had become untenable and Admiral Dönitz made one of the most difficult decisions of his career, ordering the temporary withdrawal of all U-boats from the North Atlantic, effectively conceding defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic, at least temporarily, and his war diary entry for that day reflected his anguish. The enemy has rendered the U-boat war impossible with new location devices and weapons. Losses are unbearable. The Atlantic is lost. And this from the man who had promised Hitler that U-boats would strangle Britain's supply lines, who had developed the Wolfpack tactics that had terrorized Allied convoys, who had seen his submarines sink millions of tons of shipping, but now faced the reality that his boats were being hunted by weapons they couldn't understand or counter, and the withdrawal order, transmitted to all boats at sea, was met with a mixture of relief and shame by U-boat crews. Relief that they might survive, shame that they were retreating from an enemy they couldn't even see, and at the U-boat bases in France, crews watched as boat after boat failed to return from patrol, the concrete submarine pens that had protected them from bombing raids unable to shield them from the acoustic torpedoes that hunted them in the open ocean. The Japanese naval attaché in Berlin, Captain Tadao Yokoi, reported these developments to Tokyo with considerable alarm, warning that if the Americans had developed such weapons for use in the Atlantic, they certainly had them in the Pacific as well, and recommended that all Japanese submarine operations be immediately reviewed to account for this new threat. But the Imperial Japanese Navy, still believing in the superiority of Japanese spirit over American technology, dismissed his warnings as German defeatism, insisting that Japanese submarines were superior to U-boats and that Japanese crews would find ways to evade these new weapons through superior seamanship and courage, a fatal miscalculation that would cost them dearly when submarines like I-52 encountered Fido torpedoes and discovered that spirit and courage meant nothing against acoustic homing technology. And Captain Yokoi, in his private diary, wrote prophetically that the Germans have discovered that the ocean is no longer their shield but their grave, and we refuse to learn from their sacrifice. The technical evolution that had produced the Mark 24 Fido torpedo was unknown to the Axis powers, but it represented a masterpiece of rapid wartime development, beginning in December 1941 when the U.S. Navy asked the National Defense Research Committee to consider developing an air-launched acoustic homing torpedo, and within days, both Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and Bell Telephone Laboratories had submitted proposals, with the project receiving the code name Fido supposedly standing for the dog-like tenacity with which it would pursue submarines, though officially designated as a mine to maintain security, and the development team, working around the clock, had to solve numerous technical challenges, including creating hydrophones sensitive enough to detect submarine propellers but robust enough to survive being dropped from aircraft, designing analog processing circuits using 1940s vacuum tube technology that could discriminate between targets and noise, developing a control system that could steer the torpedo based on acoustic inputs, and creating a propulsion system quiet enough not to interfere with its own sensors, and remarkably, they achieved all this in just 9 months, with the first production models delivered in March 1943, just in time to begin the systematic destruction of the U-boat fleet. The immediate impact on U-boat operations was catastrophic, with the loss rate in the Bay of Biscay jumping from near zero in early 1943 to over 20% by June, meaning that 1 in 5 boats attempting to transit the bay was being destroyed, and these weren't inexperienced crews or obsolete boats but the cream of the U-boat fleet, veteran commanders with years of combat experience, sailing the latest Type 7 and Type 9 submarines, equipped with the best technology Germany could produce, yet they were being hunted down and destroyed by a weapon that cost just $1,800 to produce, dropped by aircraft that they often never even saw, and the psychological impact was even greater than the physical losses, as U-boat crews began to refuse orders, to fake mechanical problems to avoid sailing, to deliberately damage their own boats rather than face the acoustic torpedoes waiting in the Bay of Biscay, and morale, which had remained high even during the worst periods of the war, collapsed completely as word spread that diving no longer meant safety but death. The German response to the Fido threat was confused and largely ineffective, partly because they didn't understand what they were facing, with some officers believing it was a new type of depth charge with better sinking characteristics, others thinking it was some kind of mine that activated when it detected submarine noise, and still others correctly guessing it was an acoustic homing torpedo but unable to convince the high command without physical evidence, and various countermeasures were attempted, including the bold sonar decoy, which was supposed to create false acoustic targets, but these were designed to work against ship-mounted sonar, not airborne acoustic torpedoes, and the FAT and LUT pattern running torpedoes that U-boats fired desperately when under attack, hoping to hit their attackers, but these were useless against aircraft, and the installation of more anti-aircraft guns on U-boats, creating the flak boats that were supposed to fight it out on the surface, but this just made them easier targets for conventional bombing, and nothing seemed to work against the Fido torpedoes that continued their relentless hunting in the depths. Kapitänleutnant Herbert Werner, commanding U-415, provided one of the most vivid accounts of a Fido attack when his boat was caught in the Bay of Biscay on July 30, 1943, writing later that he heard the aircraft approaching and immediately ordered a crash dive, confident that 40 meters of water would protect them, but then his hydrophone operator reported a splash followed by a mechanical whining sound. Definitely not a depth charge, and Werner ordered full speed and hard rudder, trying to evade. But the sound followed them, turned with them, grew louder, and he remembered thinking this is impossible, weapons don't chase you underwater, but this one did, and only by ordering emergency surface, accepting the risk of bombs and gunfire rather than certain death from the pursuing torpedo, did U-415 survive, though they were badly damaged by aircraft cannon fire and barely made it back to Brest, and Werner's report caused considerable debate at U-boat headquarters, with some staff officers refusing to believe that such a weapon existed, insisting that Werner had panicked and imagined the pursuit, but too many similar reports were coming in for the high command to dismiss them all as hallucinations. The Italian submarine Barbarigo, commanded by Capitano di Corvetta Roberto Rigoli, encountered what was almost certainly a Fido torpedo on June 17, 1943. While transiting the Bay of Biscay en route to the Atlantic, and Wrigley's war diary, recovered after the war, described hearing aircraft engines and ordering an immediate dive to 60 meters, deeper than usual because of the recent losses in the bay. But his sonar operator reported an unusual sound in the water, mechanical and approaching, and Wrigley ordered silent running, all motors stop, hoping whatever it was would pass by. But the sound began circling them as if searching, and after 5 minutes that seemed like hours, it moved away, though they remained silent on the bottom for another 2 hours before daring to move. And when Barbarigo finally surfaced that night, Wrigley sent a coded message to Betasom warning that the Allies had deployed some kind of underwater hunting weapon, though he couldn't explain exactly what it was, only that it had actively searched for them, and 2 days later, Barbarigo was caught again, this time without escape, the acoustic torpedo finding its mark and sending the submarine and all 49 crew members to the bottom, and the Regia Marina, receiving no further word from Barbarigo, could only list her as missing, presumed lost to enemy action. The Mark 24 Fido torpedo's success rate was remarkable by any measure, with 37 confirmed submarine kills and 18 damaged out of 204 torpedoes fired in combat, an 18% success rate compared to just 9.5% for conventional depth charges, and these statistics, compiled after the war, showed that Fido was particularly effective against submerged submarines attempting to evade, exactly the scenario it was designed for, and the acoustic homing system, primitive as it was by modern standards, proved remarkably reliable with very few torpedo failures reported, and the weapon's simplicity was actually an advantage, as it could be mass-produced quickly and cheaply, with 4,000 units manufactured by war's end, and each one potentially representing a dead submarine, a terrifying equation for the Axis submarine forces who had no effective countermeasure, no way to detect the weapon before it was dropped, and no reliable method of evading it once it was in the water, hunting them. The broader strategic impact of the Fido torpedo extended far beyond the immediate submarine kills, effectively ending the U-boat threat to Allied convoys by making the Bay of Biscay transit so dangerous that U-boats could no longer operate effectively from their French bases, and this in turn meant that boats had to operate from Norway or Germany, adding weeks to their transit times and reducing their operational endurance in the Atlantic hunting grounds, and the psychological impact on U-boat recruitment was severe, with the submarine service, once considered the elite of the Kriegsmarine, now seen as a death sentence, and new volunteers dried up, forcing the Navy to assign men rather than rely on volunteers, and these reluctant submariners, knowing they faced weapons they couldn't fight, had neither the skill nor the motivation of the veteran crews who had been destroyed in the Bay of Biscay, and the quality of the U-boat force, already degraded by the loss of experienced commanders and crews, declined precipitously. Admiral Dönitz, in his memoirs written after the war, admitted that the introduction of airborne acoustic homing torpedoes was one of the decisive factors in the defeat of the U-boat campaign, writing that we had always known that aircraft were our enemy, but we believed that diving protected us. When the enemy developed weapons that could pursue us underwater, follow our evasive maneuvers, and destroy us in what we thought was our sanctuary, the psychological effect was as devastating as the physical losses. My crews lost faith in their ability to survive, and without that faith, they could not fight effectively. And this from the man who had built the U-boat force from nothing, who had developed the tactics and strategies that nearly brought Britain to its knees, but who could find no answer to the simple yet deadly effective acoustic torpedo that hunted his submarines like the hounds of hell, following them into the depths where they had always been safe, turning their primary defensive tactic into a death trap. The Japanese experience with Fido torpedoes, while limited to fewer encounters, was equally devastating, with submarines like I-52 being destroyed with all hands, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, studying the German experience and their own losses, began to realize that their submarine doctrine, based on attacking warships rather than commerce raiding, made them even more vulnerable to acoustic homing weapons, because their boats were larger, noisier, and less maneuverable than German U-boats and commander. Makitsura Hashimoto, who commanded I-58 and survived the war, wrote later that learning about acoustic homing torpedoes was like discovering that the enemy could see in the dark when we were blind, because it negated every advantage submarines possessed: their stealth, their ability to disappear beneath the waves, their freedom to maneuver in 3 dimensions, all meaningless against a weapon that could hear them, track them, and kill them in their own element. And the Japanese, like the Germans, never developed an effective countermeasure, partly because they never fully understood the weapon's capabilities, and partly because by the time they recognized the threat, Their submarine force had already been decimated. The Italian submarines of Beta suffered proportionally even higher losses than their German allies, with boats like Tozzoli, Barbarigo, and Giuliani all falling victim to what were almost certainly Fido attacks in the Bay of Biscay, and the surviving Italian submarine commanders, meeting in Bordeaux in July 1943, concluded that further operations were suicidal, that their boats, designed for Mediterranean operations, were too slow and unmaneuverable to evade acoustic torpedoes, and several commanders, including Capitano di Fragata Primo Longobardo, formally requested permission to return to the Mediterranean, arguing that it was better to face the Royal Navy in confined waters where they at least had a chance of fighting back, rather than being hunted like animals in the Atlantic by weapons they couldn't see or evade. But the Italian High Command, under pressure from the Germans to maintain solidarity, refused these requests, condemning more boats and crews to destruction, until the Italian armistice in September 1943 finally ended Beta operations, by which time most of their submarines had already been lost. The acoustic signature that Fido torpedoes tracked was something submarine designers had never seriously considered as a vulnerability, because underwater sound propagation was poorly understood in the 1930s when most World War II submarines were designed, and features that made submarines effective large propellers for surface speed, powerful diesel engines for rapid charging of batteries, multiple electric motors for underwater maneuverability also made them noisy and easy to track acoustically, and the German Type VII submarine, the workhorse of the U-boat fleet, was particularly vulnerable, with its twin propellers creating a distinctive acoustic signature at 24 kHz, exactly the frequency the Fido torpedo was designed to detect. And attempts to quiet submarines by wrapping pipes, installing rubber mounts for machinery, or operating at slower speeds were largely ineffective, because the fundamental noise source was the propeller cavitation, the formation and collapse of bubbles as the propeller blades moved through the water. And this couldn't be eliminated without completely redesigning the propulsion system, something impossible during wartime. The Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory and Bell Telephone Labs, the two institutions that developed Fido, had approached the problem with typical American practicality, not trying to create a perfect weapon but one that was good enough to get the job done, and the decision to use passive acoustic homing rather than active sonar was crucial, because it meant the torpedo gave no warning of its approach, the first indication a submarine had of attack being the splash of the weapon entering the water, by which time it was usually too late to evade, and the choice of 24 kHz as the detection frequency was based on extensive analysis of submarine acoustic signatures, finding the frequency that was most consistently produced by submarine propellers but least likely to be generated by other sources, and the analog processing system, using vacuum tubes and capacitors in circuits that would seem primitive today, was nevertheless sophisticated enough to discriminate between a submarine and biological noise like whale calls or surface wave action, to maintain track on a maneuvering target, and to ignore countermeasures that the Germans never managed to develop effectively. The production of Fido torpedoes was a masterpiece of American industrial efficiency, with Western Electric, the manufacturing arm of Bell Telephone, producing the complex acoustic guidance systems, while General Electric provided the electric motors, and Electric Storage Battery Company manufactured the specialized batteries that had to provide high current for 10 minutes while surviving the shock of being dropped from an aircraft, and the torpedo bodies were modified Mark 13 aircraft torpedo bodies, shortened and fitted with hemispherical nose sections for the explosive charge and conical tail sections with 4 fins and a single propeller, creating what was described as a short, fat torpedo that looked nothing like conventional weapons, and production ramped up quickly from the first units in March 1943 to hundreds per month by summer, each one representing potentially another dead submarine, another crew that would never return home, another victory for Allied technology over Axis tactics. The Bay of Biscay, which U-boat crews had always known was dangerous but manageable, became by August 1943 what they called Hollandschland, Hell's Mouth, where acoustic torpedoes waited to hunt them down, where the traditional tactics of diving deep and running silent no longer worked, where experienced commanders with years of combat success were destroyed on their first encounter with Fido, and the statistics were appalling, with some flotillas losing 50% of their boats attempting to transit the bay, losses that no military force could sustain, and U-boat headquarters tried various routing strategies, having boats hug the Spanish coast where neutral waters might provide some protection, or sailing in groups for mutual support, or making the entire transit submerged despite the massive increase in time and battery consumption this required. But nothing seemed to work against the aircraft that appeared without warning, guided by centimetric radar the Germans couldn't detect, dropping acoustic torpedoes that pursued submarines wherever they tried to hide. The human cost of Fido's success was horrific, with entire submarine crews dying in the dark depths of the Bay of Biscay, their boats crushed by water pressure after the torpedo breached their hulls, and unlike surface naval combat where there might be survivors, submarine warfare offered no second chances. No opportunity for rescue when a boat was destroyed at depth, and the few U-boat crews who survived Fido attacks, usually by emergency surfacing and accepting aerial cannon fire rather than certain death from the pursuing torpedo, told horrific stories of hearing the weapon hunting them, the mechanical whine growing closer no matter which way they turned, the helplessness of being pursued by something they couldn't see or fight, could only try desperately to evade until it either found them or ran out of battery power, and these stories, spreading through the U-boat bases, destroyed morale more effectively than any propaganda could have, because they confirmed every submariner's worst nightmare, that their boats, their tactics, their training were all useless against this new American weapon. Commander Makitsura Hashimoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy, reflecting on the loss of submarines like I-52 to acoustic torpedoes, wrote in his post-war memoir that the development of Fido represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare, comparable to the introduction of radar or code breaking, because it eliminated the submarine's greatest advantage, its ability to disappear beneath the surface, and turned the ocean itself into a hunting ground where submarines were the prey, not the predators, and he noted bitterly that while Japan and Germany had focused on building bigger, faster, more heavily armed submarines, the Americans had developed a simple weapon that made all those advantages meaningless, a torpedo that cost less than $2,000 but could destroy a submarine worth millions, could kill trained crews that took years to develop, could negate decades of tactical development in submarine warfare, and Hashimoto concluded that the real lesson of Fido was not technological but philosophical, that the Americans had understood something the Axis powers had missed, that in modern warfare, the ability to find and kill the enemy was more important than speed, armor, or firepower. The German Type XXI submarine, the revolutionary Electroboot designed to counter Allied anti-submarine weapons, was partially a response to the Fido threat, with much quieter electric motors, better streamlining for higher underwater speed, and the ability to remain submerged for extended periods using snorkels, but it came too late to affect the war's outcome, with only 4 operational boats commissioned before Germany's surrender, and even these advanced submarines would have been vulnerable to Fido torpedoes because while they were quieter than Type 7 or Type 9 boats, they still produced acoustic signatures that could be tracked, still had to move to operate, still had to surface eventually, and the fundamental problem remained that once an acoustic homing torpedo was in the water and had acquired a target, there was no reliable way to evade it, no countermeasure that consistently worked, no tactic that guaranteed survival, and the U-boat force that had once terrorized the Atlantic was reduced to cowering in heavily reinforced concrete pens, afraid to venture into waters where Fido torpedoes waited to hunt them. Admiral Dönitz's decision on May 24, 1943, to withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic was unprecedented in German naval history, an admission of defeat from the force that had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine. But the statistics left him no choice, with 43 boats lost in May alone, the highest monthly loss of the war, and many of these losses attributed to the new acoustic homing torpedoes that made traditional evasive tactics useless, and his war diary entry for that day was unusually emotional for the normally controlled admiral. The Atlantic is lost. The enemy's new weapons have made our boats helpless. We must withdraw to preserve what remains of the force and hope that new technology or tactics can restore the balance. But I fear this is the end of the U-boat war as we have known it. And he was right, because while U-boats would return to the Atlantic in autumn 1943 with new equipment and tactics, they never again posed the strategic threat they had represented in the first 3 years of war, never again came close to cutting Britain's supply lines, never again held the initiative in the Battle of the Atlantic. The acoustic torpedo technology that destroyed the U-boat threat would continue to evolve after World War II, with modern submarines equipped with sophisticated countermeasures including noisemakers, bubble screens, and anechoic coatings to absorb sound. But the basic principle established by Fido remains unchanged, that a submarine's acoustic signature is its greatest vulnerability, that the ocean that hides it visually also transmits sound with remarkable efficiency, allowing acoustic weapons to track and destroy submarines at ranges where visual or radar detection would be impossible, and every submarine commander today knows what Horst von Schroeter of U-640 learned too late on May 14, 1943, that diving is no longer escape but merely entering the hunting ground of acoustic homing weapons, that the depths that once meant safety now offer only a different form of vulnerability, that the fundamental advantage of the submarine, its ability to disappear beneath the waves, has been forever compromised by weapons that can hear, track, and kill in the darkness below. The final accounting of Fido's impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was devastating for the Axis powers, with 37 submarines confirmed destroyed and 18 damaged by just 204 torpedoes fired. But the real impact was far greater than these numbers suggest, because Fido broke the U-boat force psychologically, destroyed their confidence in their basic tactics, forced them to abandon their most successful operating areas, and contributed directly to the withdrawal from the Atlantic that marked the effective end of the U-boat threat. And for the Italian submarines of Badisum and the Japanese boats attempting to exchange strategic materials with Germany, Fido was equally deadly, destroying boats like Barbarigo, Tizzoli, and I-52 with all hands, demonstrating that no Axis submarine was safe from acoustic homing attack, and the weapon that had been deliberately misnamed a mine to preserve its secrecy had proved to be exactly what its developers had hoped: a hunter that would pursue submarines relentlessly, that would follow them into the depths where they had always been safe, that would destroy them in their own element with a persistence that justified its code name, because like a hunting dog following a scent, Fido would track its prey, until it either killed it or exhausted itself trying. The legacy of the Mark 24 Fido torpedo extended far beyond World War II, establishing acoustic homing as the primary method for attacking submarines, a principle that remains true today with weapons like the Mark 48 and Mark 54 torpedoes that can track submarines at ranges and depths that would have seemed impossible to World War II submarine commanders. And every modern submarine is designed with acoustic signature reduction as a primary consideration, with natural circulation reactors to eliminate pump noise, with carefully machined propellers to minimize cavitation, with anechoic tiles to absorb active sonar, all responses to the vulnerability that Fido first exploited, and the submarine warfare that had been revolutionized by Germany's U-boats in World War I and perfected by Dönitz wolfpacks in World War II was fundamentally changed forever by a simple acoustic torpedo that cost $1,800 to produce and could be carried by even small patrol aircraft, proving that in warfare technological surprise can overcome years of tactical development, that innovation can defeat experience, and that no military advantage is permanent. The survivors of the U-boat force, the few who lived through the destruction of Black May and the following months, would never forget the terror of being hunted by Fido torpedoes, of hearing that mechanical whine in the water that meant death was pursuing them, of knowing that their primary defense had become useless, that diving meant entering the killing ground of acoustic homing weapons, and in their post-war memoirs and interviews, they consistently identified the introduction of airborne acoustic torpedoes as the moment when they knew the war was lost, when the Atlantic that had been their hunting ground became their grave, when the depths that had protected them became their tomb, and many admitted that they had never really understood what they were facing, had never known that it was called Fido or how it worked, had known only that something was hunting them underwater, something that could hear them and track them and kill them with a persistence that seemed almost supernatural, and that against this invisible hunter, their training, their experience, their courage all meant nothing, because you cannot fight what you cannot see, cannot evade what follows you into the depths, cannot survive when your only defense has been turned against you.